Hi, welcome to Cool Time, a show about air conditioning. Today we're going to talk about AC hose makeup and repair. And that's important because system leaks account for more than 50% of all automotive AC service. So when your customers are looking for an AC parts supplier, chances are they're looking for someone who makes up AC hose. But the best news is that customizing and repairing AC hose is very profitable. Plus, you only need a few special tools. In fact, we're going to show you everything you need to make AC hose assembly and repair a profitable part of your temperature control business. So, what do you say? Let's get started. Now, when I talk about hoses, I don't just mean hoses. I mean the entire hose assembly, the hose and all the parts that make it up. And when I say fittings, I'm not talking about getting a new suit. I'm talking about the connector on the end of the hose. Now, today, most AC hose fittings are either male or female, depending on the nut or coupler used to connect the hoses. And they're either flare or O-ring, depending on the kind of sealing seat used to seal the fittings together. We'll talk more about fittings later. Now, let's talk a little bit about AC hose. Basically, AC hose comes in 4 different sizes: 6, 8, 10, and 12, depending on the inside diameter of the hose. So, the bigger the number, the bigger the hose. Plus, in most cases, each size of hose is used for a specific part of the AC system. For instance, you'll usually find number 8 hose in the discharge line between the compressor and the condenser, number 6 hose, called liquid line, between the condenser and the evaporator, and number 10 or 12 hose, called suction hose, between the evaporator and the compressor. In general, most factory-installed AC systems use number 12 suction hose, but you will find some number 10 on some imports, dealer-installed units, and some aftermarket systems. Now let's find out what these hoses are made of. In R12 systems, the most commonly used refrigerant hose is probably 2-braid. And despite whatever you might be thinking, 2-braid refers to the number of reinforced braids used to strengthen the hose. Another refrigerant hose, found on many OE liquid lines, is called nylon, because that's what it's made of. Unfortunately, nylon hose is extremely rigid and prone to kinking, so it's generally impractical in tight situations. Now, given today's concern for ozone depletion, the most common hose on most late-model GM applications is probably Parflex 80 or Parflex 90. A Parflex hose reduces permeation, or the refrigerant's ability to seep through the hose. However, Parflex hoses require special O-ring fittings to join the fittings to the hose. And regular conventional barb fittings, well, those can tear the nylon core, causing the hose to leak. Now, to avoid this problem and still reduce permeation, I recommend easy-to-use, environmentally friendly nylon barrier hose. This hose sandwiches the barrier inside the hose material. This means you get reduced permeability without unbarbed fittings. In fact, barrier hose is so convenient, I recommend using it to replace Parflex hose whenever you make AC repairs. Barrier hose comes in all 4 sizes, and it's great for snacks too. Oh boy, now we're going to talk about O-rings, okay? Until recently, an O-ring was just an O-ring. But today, they're used all over your car or truck, and they're made from a lot of different materials. In fact, R12 systems use nitrile O-rings, and R134A systems need neoprene or HNBR O-rings. So when you replace an O-ring, make sure you use AC service O-rings, and you've got the right one for the job. Now, when you install an O-ring, you have to remember a few basic rules. The first one is to use the right tool for the job, which in this case is no tool at all. However, you do want to remember never to stretch the O-ring. A stretched O-ring can leak, and in general, leaky hoses are not good for overall customer satisfaction. What you do want to remember, though, is that you must lubricate the O-ring before you install it, and it's very important to do that properly. Now, I recommend giving it a good shot of refrigerant oil from a can like this. Oh, you want to remember to hit the O-ring. But the important thing to remember is never soak your O-rings. Soaked O-rings may swell, resulting in poor seals and leaky hoses. To install your O-ring, just roll it over the end of the fitting like so, and slip it into the seat. Now remember, whenever you disconnect a component, you've got to replace the O-rings. They should never be reused. Distorted, stretched, or improper O-rings can cause leaks, so always be sure that you're using new ones and that you've got the right part for the job. Now, before we get down to actually building an assembly, let's talk about some of the different kinds of fittings that you can use. The first kind of fitting you need to know about is called the flared fitting. Now, this fitting is great for your AC repair business because it uses flared metal-to-metal seal held together by a nut. Now, this arrangement transmits stress and vibration to the nut, causing it to loosen. So, flared fittings tend to leak. That's why you'll only find them on older cars and trucks or the AC system your customer may have picked up at Dirty Jake's Automotive AC Dollar Store. They're just not used anymore. On the other hand, an O-ring fitting uses a notch on the female end to hold an O-ring in place and a stop on the male end to locate and secure it. So the O-ring actually seals the fitting. The nut just holds it together. More importantly, the O-ring absorbs vibration, which reduces fitting leaks. And that's why standard O-ring fittings are typically used as hose end fittings in automotive AC systems. Another important fitting uses a captive O-ring. Now, this fitting was introduced by GM in 1985 and looks like a standard fitting, except it has a groove next to the bead that the O-ring fits into. The bad news about captive groove fittings is that they use a special, thicker style O-ring. So, if you're working with captive O-rings, be sure to use the right ones. Now, one last O-ring fitting is called the spring lock fitting, which you'll find on Ford, Lincoln, Mercury, and some late model Chrysler products. With this fitting, the male end has two O-rings and a special cage that holds a garter spring. But the female end does have a flared lip that locks behind the spring when you snap the ends together. Assembling a spring lock fitting is basically a two-step process. First, remember to lubricate the O-rings. Once you've done that, snap the fitting all the way in place. Now, remember that this fitting uses a special kind of O-ring, and you'll want to keep plenty of these O-rings and garter springs in stock because these fittings often leak. That's why we make a complete line of fully interchangeable OE replacement spring lock fittings and a spring lock repair kit. With these parts, you can avoid replacing an entire hose assembly and save the cost of expensive dealer parts. You can also buy spring lock fittings with built-in orifice tubes. Now, just like hair comes in different shapes and styles, so do automotive AC fittings. For R12 systems, probably the most common style is the 3-barb fitting. Now, this fitting comes in two pieces, the fitting itself and the crimping collar. And you can use this kind of fitting with either 2-braid hose or nylon barrier hose. Just as important, you need to attach 3-barb fittings with face-style crimps. Now, we'll talk more about this kind of crimp later in the program. For now, remember, you should not use 3-barb fittings or face crimps in R134A systems. For R134A systems, you need the new style bead lock fittings. Plus, you've got to use nylon barrier hose and the new style bubble crimp. The one-piece bead lock fitting is easier to use than the 3-barb fitting, but the really good news is that you can use it on an R12 system also. And again, we'll talk more about the bubble crimp later on in the program. Now though, let's consider some of the specialty fittings that you'll find as you make up and repair hose assemblies. For starters, consider this compressor fitting. This particular one came out of our director's car. And what's important for him to know is that if I don't get surf and turf for lunch, he doesn't get this back. But what's important for you to know is that compressor fittings are application specific. So when you need one, you'll probably want to look it up in the application or illustrated section of our handy dandy hose makeup catalog. Be sure to get yourself one today. And while you're reading it, remember that some compressor fittings come with mufflers. And if the original equipment assembly includes one, you'll want to include one on your replacement assembly as well. Otherwise, your customer may complain about the car sounding too loud. Also, just to be different, Chrysler likes to use block fittings in their cars and trucks. Block fittings are application specific and generally use gaskets or O-rings to make the seal. Another handy fitting is the splicer, which you can use to customize or repair an assembly and save your customer money. Now, these fittings come in metal to rubber, rubber to rubber, or metal-to-metal variations and can really cut down on the cost of a repair. Now, you'll need them for a lot of newer cars and trucks that use block fittings, or for long, complex bent fittings that are easier to repair than to replace. Now, splicers are also great when you can't find the part or assembly that you need, or for real beaters that aren't worth the cost of a repair. Well, that just about wraps up this first part of the program on the different kinds of fittings, O-rings, and hoses you can expect to find on mobile air conditioning systems. So get out there and find them. And when you do, bring them back here. There'll be a short quiz in the morning. Oh, hey, I see you're back. And if you turn around, I can see your front. Just kidding. In this section of the program, we're going to teach you everything you need to know to be a real pro. In short, we're going to teach you how to stuff and crimp with the best of them. That's because this part of the program is about making hose assemblies. Now, as I said before, rule one for making up any hose is have the right tool for the job. Now, you may think I have the right tool and the left one, but what we need here is not a pair of wrenches. What we need is a crimper. And believe it or not, there are lots of different crimpers out there, but to make the choice simple, I recommend the bubble crimper. Bubble crimpers crimp the fitting around the hose. They make the best and tightest AC crimps, and they're faster and easier to use. In fact, R134A systems require bubble crimps, beadlock fittings, and nylon barrier hose to meet SAE standard J2064 for R134A hose and fittings. But you can use bubble crimps and beadlock fittings on R12 systems too. So, when I want to crimp a hose the right way, I use a bubble crimper. Now, this particular crimper uses a standard 1/2 inch drive impact wrench or ratchet with a standard 1 inch socket to crimp the fitting. And it comes with 4 sets of dies, one for each size hose. We also have a hydraulic style bubble crimper which uses a specially designed hydraulic jack to crimp the fitting. A common older style crimper for R12 systems is the face crimp, also called a surface or barrel crimp, depending on who you're talking to. Face crimpers crimp the fitting the long way, or parallel to the hose, kind of like the staves in a barrel. Plus, they use 3 barb fittings that come in 2 pieces. This particular face crimper uses a hydraulic jack to crimp the fitting and comes with 2 sets of dies with 4 cutouts each. It also comes with a hose stuffer because surface crimps and fittings are really tough to stuff. And finally, you're also going to need a top quality hose cutter, one that makes a good, clean, straight-edged cut. Now, this helps to make sure that the fitting meets the hose and gives you a good tight seal. Also, if you want to repair a metal line, you're going to need a tube cutter. Now, before you begin any hose repair, you're going to have to assess the situation. And to do that, you've got to become a hose detective. 8:32 a.m. I arrived on the scene and found my customer's car. Air conditioning didn't work. The test for leaks was positive, so I removed the defective assembly. I checked out the damaged part. Compressor fitting, suction line, discharge line. The way I figured it, this could only be one thing. Compressor hose assembly. Now, a rookie would have called homicide at this point because these things can be murder, but I knew I could handle it. I checked out the discharge line more closely. In cases like this, a lot of times, that's the culprit. I was right. Seems it couldn't handle the heat, the vibration, the pressure. Blew itself in two. Whenever I run across a leak like this, I always like to ask myself a couple of questions, because I'm not the brightest guy in the world. So play along with me here. Now, the first question is this. Are both of these hoses leaking, or is it just the one? And if only one of them is leaking now, is the other one going to start leaking anytime soon? Because if it is, we may want to go ahead and replace them both right now. See what I'm getting at? Another thing just occurs to me. I wonder if we should try to repair this instead of rebuilding the entire thing. Now there's a thought. 9:13 a.m. Friday. I just finished checking out the customer's car. I wanted to find out why that hose had split. I checked out the motor mounts. They checked out fine. Then I checked to see if the vehicle had a torque strut. It didn't. So I guess the solution? Add an extra inch of hose to my new assembly. That way it'll be more flexible next time. After you've assessed the situation, you can begin to make up the new assembly. And always be sure you have the original before you start. Now, as you can see, this assembly has a number 12 straight female O-ring fitting on the suction line and a number 8 45-degree O-ring fitting on the discharge line. Now, on some older cars, the compressor fitting may be reusable, but in this case, because we have bead lock fittings, we're going to have to replace the compressor fitting too. Now, all of these components are available through your catalog. Now that you know what fittings to use, you'll need to figure out how much hose to get. To do this, measure from the far end of the crimping collar on one end of the suction line to the far end of the crimping collar on the other. Now do the same thing with the discharge line. For this assembly, we'll need 20 inches of number 12 hose and 15 3/4 inches of number 8 hose because we've added the extra inch. I recommend using nylon barrier hose because it reduces permeation. Next, tally up the damage and prepare your estimate, pricing each fitting and the total amount of hose to the nearest foot. Finally, be sure to include lots of AC repair profits because making up AC hoses is fun and profitable. And now it's time to get right down to the real nitty-gritty. And breaking it down on the old beadlock crimper is your pal and mine, Al Wright. Wave to the camera, Al. Using your pre-cut hose, begin by stuffing the suction hose into the fitting, checking the hole in the collar to make sure you stuff it all the way. Then do the same for the discharge line. Next, stuff both hoses onto the compressor fittings. And remember, with beadlock fittings, you don't need to lubricate the hose or the fitting. Now, with all the fittings stuffed, match them in the direction of the old fittings, and you've made up a new assembly that looks like the old one, except it hasn't been crimped. And if you try to install it like this, it'll leak like crazy and probably fall apart. Now, to keep this from happening, you need to crimp the hose. But before you do, you've got to set the crimper for the right size hose. Now, as you can see, this crimper comes with a set of dies. And to help you pick the right one, they're color-coded. But to make things really simple, the hose size number is stamped right on the back. Now, since we're going to be starting with the discharge hose, Al is going to need the number 8. Hey, Al, catch. Nice guy, but not too swift, you know what I mean? After you pick up the die, place it in the holder, making sure the keys snap into the slot. Then you're ready to give your assembly the big squeeze. With the dies in place, open the crimper and put the AC fitting into the crimper, centering it in the die. Then put your impact wrench over the impact screw, squeeze the trigger, and crimp the fitting. And while you're at it, be sure to close the crimping collars all the way. On this crimper, it can look like you've squeezed the dies together when they're only halfway closed. So make sure the metal parts of the die meet all the way. Finally, reverse your impact wrench to loosen the crimper and check your crimp. If everything looks okay, go ahead and crimp the hose end fitting of the discharge line the same way. Now it's time to crimp the suction hose. And since it's a big fat one like this, we're going to have to reset the crimper for number 12 hose, which means that Al is going to need the number 12 die. Here, Al, catch. Nice catch, Al. Now, take out the number 8 dies and put in the number 12 dies. And again, make sure the fitting is centered in the crimper. Then whip out your impact wrench and do everything you just did all over again, just like you did it the first time. And when you're done,
golly, just like on TV, you cooked up your very first professional hose assembly.
Now, if you're not lucky enough to have one of these handy-dandy bubble crimpers, you're probably going to have to make do with the old-style surface crimp, which really isn't all that bad if you're working on an R12 system. As you can see from this film, made sometime in the last 50 years, surface crimps work pretty much like beadlock crimps, except for a few important differences. First, you've got to remember that surface crimp fittings come in 2 pieces. So, before you stuff the fitting, you've got to slide the collar over the hose. And be sure to include crimping collars when you spec the job. Second, you've got to lubricate the fittings and the hoses with AC refrigerant oil, and use a hose stuffer to put the fittings onto the hose, because surface crimp fittings are a real bear. Everything else is pretty much the same, but remember to read the instructions that come with your stuffer and your crimper. Well, that just about wraps it up for this part of the program, but don't run away just yet. In the next section, you'll learn how to make the big bucks while saving your customers money by repairing and splicing AC hose. You know, part of being a professional is knowing when to punt. Now, sometimes after you complete an evaluation, you may find that you really don't want or need to make up a new assembly. Sometimes you may want to sell your customer a prefab hose, like the ones listed in the applications section of your parts catalog. In fact, pre-made hose assemblies, such as the ones for Ford liquid lines or non-repairable hose assemblies with the accumulator already attached, make your job a lot easier and your customer a lot happier. Other times you may find that what your customer really needs is a hose repair or splice. Take the compressor fitting I took out of the producer's car. To show you what I'm talking about, I took a hacksaw and put a really neat gash partway through one of the metal lines when I didn't get that surf and turf I wanted. This gash could just as easily have been caused by a rub, but the important point is now it's a good example of a hose assembly that you may want to repair rather than replace. Now, depending on the circumstances involved, you could make this repair a couple of different ways. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, what kind of fittings or splicer do I need? In this case, the leak point is right at a bend in the line. Too bad. That means you can't use a metal-to-metal splicer because you'd straighten out the bend and the assembly wouldn't fit anymore. This means the best thing to do is use a metal-to-rubber compression fitting and replace the center part of the line. For this job, we'll need 2 metal-to-rubber fittings, both for number 12 hose. To use any compression fitting, you need about 1 inch of straight pipe. So, because of the bends in the fitting, we'll replace the hose from here to here. First, whip out your tube cutter, tighten the adjustment, and cut the line. Wow, that gives me the swirlies just watching it. Next, yank the nut gently off the compression fitting, slide it over the line, and slide the compression ferrule over the line too. Then push the metal line into the threaded part of the fitting until it can't go any further. Now, hold the parts together as you tighten the nut, keeping pressure on the line and tightening until the threads bottom out. Good job, Al. For the other end of the line, make sure the fitting is pointing in the right direction. That's very important. Then slide the nut and ferrule over the line. Put the metal line in the male fitting and tighten the female nut the same way you did on the other end. Finally, measure the amount of hose you'll need, then stuff the fittings over both ends, and crimp the fittings using your handy-dandy beadlock crimper. When you're done, you've gone a long way towards making a timely, economical, and practical AC repair. Okay, sometimes when you've got a little teeny leak in a great big rubber hose, or when you've got a small leak in any rubber AC hose actually, you may want to use one of these handy-dandy rubber-to-rubber splicers. Now, for this job, line up the fitting just right and cut out the bad section of hose using your totally sharp professional hose cutter. Snip, snip. Then stuff the hoses into the fitting and crimp those babies like there's no tomorrow. Just kidding. Crimp it normally, really. That's about all there is to it, especially if you use the environmentally friendly beadlock crimps, which make less work for you. Finally, there are a whole bunch of products out there that are just great for working with AC hose assemblies. For example, if the hose you're replacing has a hose protector, you'll probably want your hose to have a protector too. Another great product is this orifice tube repair kit. Now, this is great for situations where you can't get the thing out of the car, and the only way to get it out is to cut it out and splice in the repair kit. You can find it in the illustrated fittings section of your parts catalog. And last but not least, these universal compressor fittings work really well for customizing a hose, or when you're working on an older car or truck and can't find the right part. Well, I could tell you we're all out of time for this training segment, but I'd be lying. After all, we can make these things as long as we want. The truth is, this is all you're going to get for now. Besides, how much of this stuff do you really want to watch anyhow? So, we'll see you on the next installment of Cool Time.